Welcome to MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is Open Forum, and today we will be discussing Sharia law and should non-Muslims fear Sharia law. There's a lot of excitement around the topic. It's often misunderstood, so we'll go through a three-phase approach. We'll understand what is Sharia law, what are the practical applications of Sharia law, and what are some of the concerns from non-Muslims around Sharia law in the United States and beyond, in Europe and around the world. Well, we have two great panelists here today. First, we have Amjad Khan, who's a adjunct professor of law at University of California, Los Angeles. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Dr. Mansoor Qureshi, who is a heart surgeon in Detroit. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Sharia law, what is it?
Well, first off, Sharia isn't just law. So Sharia is much more than law. Sharia, literally the word means a path to life-giving water. What that means is it's a code that governs the behavior of Muslims. And so a portion of Sharia includes penal code laws, but a small portion. It also includes things broader, the way you self-govern, the way Muslims behave with each other, a set of rules and parameters. And the path to life-giving water, it really is a path forward. How do Muslims live their life in an organized manner, in a manner that's consistent with the principles of the Quran?
So, Mansoor, is there a list of these laws that exist somewhere? Where did they come from?
So everything in Islam is based on the holy book, the Holy Quran, right? So just like you get a package insert or instruction manual, Quran gives us this guide or code of conduct. How do you live your life individually and as a community, socially, family life? So based on the verses of the Quran and the life of the Prophet, we've been told this is how we spend our lives.
So it's embedded in the Quran. Throughout the Quran, there are laws that are pulled together. Absolutely. And they're considered Sharia law.
Right. There's no chapter as such that says, okay, here, Sharia law is now starting, clause number 1, 2, 3. It's not like that.
So is Sharia law Islamic law?
Yes, Sharia is grounded in Islam. Purely. It is not meant or intended to be imposed on non-Muslims. It's a very important point and a point that is crucial in terms of its application. Sharia is based on two pillars of governance in Islam, which is mentioned in the Quran: amanat, trust, and adl, justice. It's mentioned in chapter 4, verse 59 of the Quran. These are the two pillars of governance. And critically, Sharia is there are certain specific rules governing penal provisions, like punishments, and so that portion of Sharia is what gets magnified and amplified in the media. The Islamic punishments, yes, a portion of Sharia does concern punitive measures, but Sharia is much more than that, and critically, it's imposed by Muslims on Muslims.
And I think it's.
So to that point, so in these Muslim majority countries, when they enact laws that are nationwide, that are based on Sharia law, and all their laws are the law of the land, so therefore they're implemented on non-Muslims as well. That's fair, right?
So, well, general laws, first of all, the Muslim countries, if their government should make laws that are general, that can apply to everybody. They shouldn't be imposing any Islamic principles that apply to Muslims to non-Muslims.
For instance, what?
So, for example, about prayers or worship, or as Amjad was mentioning about any of the punitive laws that can't be applied to any non-Muslim. And going back to the punishment issues, there are a lot of other things in Sharia that has to be implemented before even we get to punishment. For example, the laws or recommendations about provision, recommendation about justice, recommendations about the system of testimony and taking care of others, zakat, and taking care of the poor. All of these things have to be implemented before even we start talking about punishment. If everything else is established, it'll be even difficult or hard to get to.
The basic laws, the Ten Commandments, things like that are simpler. But let's talk about women for a second. Is it fair to say that by and large these laws are anti-women? But when we see the application of it, I see lots of pictures in Afghanistan. I see lots of pictures where it clearly seems, or Saudi Arabia, even more modern countries with lots of financial resources, where women can't drive. So there must be some anti-women provisions in these.
I think that's the most unfortunate part, because if we look really into the true teachings of Islam and the Holy Quran, we will see that it is all about for the rights of the women. And the things that we see on TV or internet, as you mentioned, are more more cultural and
But come on, I mean, they're actually implementing these laws. I mean, there are
they are.
countries where women can't drive still.
Right, absolutely, which is wrong. It's got no basis in the teachings of the Quran.
But they're saying it's from Sharia law.
Well, this is the fundamental problem that many Muslim majority countries have taken Sharia to mean something very literal, very specific that can be imposed on non-Muslims. For example, a 60-year-old Christian woman can be flogged for selling alcohol in Indonesia.
Right.
I'm just taking an example that you might see in the news.
Yeah.
The problem with that is the imposition of those Islamic laws on non-Muslims is quintessentially un-Islamic. It exists, but it's not justified. The reason being is in Islam, you can't impose law on people who aren't believing what you believe. So the Prophet of Islam, from whom all Muslims follow his example, he never imposed any Islamic law on non-Muslims. In fact, he would actually apply the law of their faith. For example, if there was a dispute between a Jew and a Muslim, he'd apply the law that existed in the Torah, not the Quran. So in Medina, when there was governance.
It's interesting in that in 2016, and beyond, as the world is becoming a global village, there is no country where it's predominantly Muslims or predominantly Christians. So it will be impossible to apply faith-based laws in any government or anything like that.
Once they interpret those laws, I mean, in America, a lot of the laws are Judeo-Christian based, but once they become the law of the land, then it doesn't necessarily, couldn't the argument be that, yeah, they were rooted in that, but now they're the law of the land, so you can't sell alcohol.
You can impose Islamic law on those non-Muslims who opt in to the system. If a non-Muslim is living in an Islamic society and voluntarily wants to submit to a legal process that Islam defines, that's permitted. But if non-Muslims don't want to be bound by the strictures of Islamic law, they can't be forced. Of course, we know the fundamental precept in the Quran, there is no compulsion in faith. La ikraha fi din. It's actually unique to Islam, and the only holy book that actually says there's no compulsion is the Quran, right? And that, by the way, is not a verse that's somehow been canceled or obsolete. It was revealed twice in Mecca and Medina. Why is that critical in Islamic history? Medina was the time when there was rule-making authority, when the Prophet was put in a position of authority, and yet, nevertheless, he still prevented compulsion.
And even beyond that, it's not only just no compulsion. The verse also, another verse says, "Lakum dinukum waliya din," means it allows people to practice their own faith. It means for me, my religion; for you, your religion.
So your argument is a safe place, and the Quran supports for separation of mosque and state. So let me ask you another question. There's a lot of interpretation of Sharia law in order to for our means to conquest other lands. I mean, you take Syria, you take some of these extremist groups, or some would call extremist group, other would call them whatever, but they believe they're leveraging the law of the Quran to for their actions.
Yeah,
is that true?
Absolutely not. And it's unfortunate because the first verse that was revealed about war in the Quran all talks about self-defense. And self-defense not for a political reason, but only for the fact that you call yourself, you preach, Allah, and you call yourself a Muslim, and that's when if you're attacked, you can self-defense. But there's no other war as such mentioned on the basis of religion. Political wars, countries have been fighting, and even Muslim countries fought. We're not here to defend or judge them. But for basis of faith, there is no concept.
So who are the leaders? Who are the Muslim leaders who are fighting? I mean, in Syria, there's a Muslim leader who's stating, no, this is how things are. Are there other Muslim leaders who are promoting your point of view?
I think there are many Muslim leaders that are promoting a peaceful interpretation of Islam. I think if you look at Bashar al-Assad, or you look at some leaders in isolation in some Muslim countries, that's not emblematic of the 56 countries that exist. I think the fundamental problem in the Islamic world is a misunderstanding that somehow Islamic law and Islamic punishments should be normalized for all of humanity. And you talked about a separation of mosque and state. It's very critical that there is no specific form of government that the Quran mentions. The Quran speaks of adaptive political structures, democracy, monarchy, theocracy, but some Muslim countries have assumed there needs to be an Islamic state. Of course, we even have a whole Daesh is saying that we need to create an Islamic state. That's code for trying to impose Sharia law, but that's against the teachings of the Quran.
So you gave an example of political leaders. What about religious leaders?
I think that is one of the I shouldn't say word weakness, but the Muslim countries in general lack a spiritual leader, except His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the spiritual.
So what does he say?
So he's the head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and he has been very vocal and out there presenting the true teachings of Islam, which talk about actually personal reformation first, apply the Sharia to the soul, to the self first, and reform ourselves as Muslims and present those true teachings to the rest.
And does he have followers in multiple
He
countries?
has millions of followers in over 200 countries, and they are trying to adapt those Sharia laws in their lives and still live with other people of other
So
faith.
let's transition to what is the positive application of Sharia law? Why does it exist? Where can it be applied in real life?
I think in very practical terms to self-govern in disputes that arise between and among Muslims. We see this with Jews and Catholics in America. You can self-govern by having a limited set of laws to resolve disputes. You can apply the Quran and aspects of the Sharia if you have a familial dispute or a marital dispute or a property dispute. Beth Dean does it for Jewish disputes in America. Catholics do it, and we see it all over the world. So Sharia does have a place, but in order to impose Sharia from a punitive perspective, from legal perspective, punishments, that's much more dramatic. And I think that requires preconditions to be met. You need to secure people's rights before you can impose any kind of restrictions in this manner.
So give me an example of an application within two families. So how would you use Sharia law to resolve an issue?
So I think Sharia, as we talked about earlier, is way beyond than just a law, right? It's a guidance, it's a teaching, it's a recommendation. So Amjad mentioned about familial disputes, marital discord.
So give me an example.
So if there is a separation that has to take place, in Islam also women have a right to divorce. So if a divorce has to take place, what's the best and most peaceful and respectable way to divorce? And Islam provides, or the Quran provides guidance. That's a great application of Sharia, because that takes care of the right of women.
So those individuals choose to go through, like you're saying, through a religious leader to resolve their differences and to do an amicable separation versus going through the courts?
Right. As the system in our community, Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we do have a system.
So give me a real application of it.
So, for example, as I mentioned, a divorce has to take place or separation. Then you go through you don't even have to go to the local court. You can go to our community's system of Sharia laws, and they'll guide the two parties through in a very peaceful way, and watching out for the rights of the women.
And why is that better than saying going through the courts?
Well, I think that especially in regard to women, they will have a place that they can present their case, and it could be resolved under the Islamic recommendations and guidance. As
it's better for one reason. Both parties believe in the legal application that they're going to be bound by, volunteer into the process, opt in. So let's say there's a divorce and there's separation of property. Many states in America have different property laws, but if you want to follow the Islamic concept of, let's say, inheritance or property distribution, if both sides are Muslim, they want to be governed by that process, and a U.S. judge may not be familiar with that process. So of course it makes sense to go to opt into a religious court, a religious process that's cheaper, more effective, less cumbersome. And so that's where Sharia actually has good application.
And it's not against the law of the land. It's
sure.
accepted.
You can practice this. This is a form of arbitration. Is that how that would work?
Exactly.
Okay. In terms of countries, there are Muslim countries. When they speak to each other, do they use Sharia law in resolving disputes?
I think that if there's disputes between and among Islamic countries, yes. I think that if there's a dispute resolution and both sides believe that Islamic principles apply, you would use Islamic law. But here's the problem: Sharia law's application is so different from Saudi and Pakistan and Indonesia and Egypt and Turkey.
Really? They don't even agree on what Sharia law is?
Well, for example, do you punish people who leave Islam? Apostates. Some would argue that you can kill apostates. And other Muslim countries will say, no, that's un-Islamic. So there is real debate internally.
Sharia law is up to interpretation?
It is, indeed. Interpretation, there's a concept called ijtihad, the notion of interpreting Quranic pronouncements. And people have different interpretations, and then they try to develop another Arabic term, ijma, consensus around how to apply Sharia. And that differs across the Muslim world.
But come back to present day, there are two countries that are in conflict. Saudi Arabia is in conflict.
Yeah.
Shouldn't the Sharia law provide them a path out of that conflict?
Well, if they have an agreement on those
So that there's
laws,
they just can't. There's not
it's
even agreement in the Muslim world what
right.
how to interpret these laws. They are largely up to interpretation.
There's no international Islamic courts. They don't exist. There's Islamic courts in countries, and you may have a Shia application of it or a Sunni application of it, or a Hanafi perspective. There's so many different perspectives, and so there isn't an international court that governs. Instead, the Muslim countries need to opt into the universal human rights standards, which are natural rights that all of humanity should follow. Those are grounded in the Quran, and those applications should be for everyone.
So a worldwide religious leader, what does His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad say about this?
He says it precisely that the true human rights that exist in Islam should be universal human rights. There's no relative, Islamic rights that should be imposed on everyone. He says we should separate mosque and state, which the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is very unique in that concept, because Islam, we're not calling for a secular, form of government. You can have a religious form of government. When it comes to the imposition of law, though, however, there are matters for the state and there are matters for religion. And when you're living in a ethnic, multi-religious society, you cannot combine those things like you see in Saudi or perhaps Iran. And
so His Holiness is very clear on this.
Very clear on that.
And he, the biggest principle of Sharia that is mentioned in the Holy Quran is absolute justice. And that's His Holiness keeps talking about that if you use that one principle, forget the faith or religion, the differences that may be, then we can find solutions to all these problems we're talking about. The justice could be between people, between those who are governing and ordinary people, in between countries, internationally, nationally, locally. If we use the principle of absolute justice and watching out for the rights of the needy, I think we can solve a lot of problems that way. And that is a Sharia principle.
He's even more specific than that. He says we need to excise those laws that are being unjustly imposed on non-Muslims, like blasphemy laws. So one of the few courageous Muslim leaders that is condemning those harsh laws that exist all over the world. Wow. He calls them obnoxious, toxic laws.
Wow. So there's a voice, a worldwide leader who is taking on this issue in over 200 nations, millions of followers, and it seems like he's out speaking in countries as well around the world on this topic. There's great unrest in the world, and perhaps that will address that. But let's transition a little bit to United States of America. There was candidate Trump, who most thought was just a fad. Then he became President-elect Trump, then President Trump. As he evolved through each of those stages, he's been saying some pretty he's giving fuel to the flame and the fears of Americans, in particular, for the fear of Sharia law, particularly in Middle America. How are those fears grounded on good principles?
They are not. The notion of a creeping Sharia being imported from a Muslim country and applying in America is really an attempt to try to stoke fears against Muslims unfairly. I think it's debunked. There is no threat of Sharia coming to America because we have the supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is supreme over any other foreign laws, and we have what's called the disestablishment principle. There's a separation of church and state in the U.S., and courts will routinely strike down any laws or any system that thwart that. So it's just more of a political.
So I want to believe
effort.
What you're saying, yeah. But this is the President of the United States, and there are people out there who are. Hate crimes are up. There's a lot of good data to show that if the President of the country is talking about this, there must be something to it.
I think we have to realize that America, the whole country almost has lived in a silo pretty much for a long time, distance from the rest of the world. And now we're learning the hard way. Unfortunately, there are people who may be different from us, their faiths who may be different from us. And on both sides, some of the Muslims maybe, and people around Trump and Trump himself are basing all of this on ignorance, unfortunately. And I think it's very important that we educate the rest of our American brothers and sisters who are they haven't met a Muslim, they don't know what Islam is, they don't know the difference between Islam and a Muslim. And to tell the president elect or candidate comes up and says, well, they're invading and they're about to destroy it, they start to believe.
And it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding, does it not? That conflating the entire faith of over 1 billion people with the laws of a few Muslim countries. They can't separate those two.
So what are you guys doing about this? What are you doing in America to counter this? Do you have any campaign out there that's trying to share the true message here?
There is a campaign called True Islam at trueislam.com. One of the principles of this 11-point campaign is to call for the separation of mosque and state. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community is leading that effort nationwide. People from both political parties, from law enforcement, local, state, people who aren't religious, they're all endorsing this campaign, which is to define true Islam as being against the fusion of these concepts in a manner that's harsh. So we are leading on the effort to say all Muslims should believe in the separation of mosque and state.
And not only that, it's not just word. We have other campaigns like Muslims for Life and Muslims for Peace. So we're putting our actions with our words.
So you're in Middle America. In Detroit, in Michigan. Middle America, where jobs have been lost. People are there's a lot of economic disparity. Lots of challenges there, and people are afraid of not being able to live. And you start pointing fingers when that happens.
Absolutely.
What are you doing locally? Give me. I get the national example. Give me a hyper local example. And how are people reacting? These are the folks who are really afraid of Islam. And to your point earlier, I've seen data around the Pew Research where 64% of Americans have never knowingly even met a Muslim.
Right.
So you've got this air cover of a national campaign, but tell me what's going on in Middle America.
So the most important thing, I think, is education again and interaction with others. So inviting people to the mosques and
tell me
going
what
to
you've
their
exactly
churches.
done.
So one of the very interesting things we have done is we have had this weekly open house, if you will, or we call it the coffee cake and True Islam, where we invite people from churches, from neighborhoods, from communities, from schools to come in and sit down with us, have a cup of coffee and ask questions. And it started with 1 or 2 or 3 people. Now 8, 10, 15 and more are showing up into these sessions, and they ask questions.
And what are their questions? What
So
are
the
their fears?
questions were very basic to start with. They're all worried about, Quran tells you to kill other people. That's the first question.
Sharia law.
Sharia law, that's what it is. And there's a verse quoted on the internet everywhere. And all you have to do is present them verse before and verse after, and they try to realize. And by the end of the session, they're like, what can we do to help?
Wow.
And what can we do to
From a
remove
Muslim
these
ally,
misconceptions? Absolutely.
All right. So give me your closing thoughts around an average American who doesn't know much about Islam. How should he learn about the issues and make a decision for themselves on whether they should be afraid of Sharia law or your interpretation of Sharia law and the interpretation of His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad's interpretation of Sharia law? How do they go about making that decision, and how do they go out and meet a Muslim to really engage in this conversation?
I would say don't be afraid of words in Islam. Jihad and Sharia have become these ugly, perverted words. They're beautiful words. If you meet a Muslim, you'll see that Sharia is their self-governance. That's really all it is. Jihad is the inner struggle, right? These words have been abused by political leaders and to stoke fears. And what I would say is
extremists as well.
Yeah, extremists as well. And I understand the fears because we suffer, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community suffers at the hands of extreme groups. America's enemies are our enemies in that regard as well. So we understand how harsh applications can have real human consequences. What I would say is go to a mosque, visit your local mosque. Mosques should be open, and anyone can come and see if you can observe Sharia law. You'll see Sharia law on display every night. People worshiping, people self-regulating, people living their lives in quiet contemplation and prayerful, and then you'll see there's a lot of convergence, right? Every faith has some kind of self-governance, whether you're a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. Everyone has their own Sharia.
Visit a mosque, great.
Yeah,
Closing thoughts.
No, I agree with Amjad, and I think if there is a recommendation I would give is not believe in going to these Google websites that you Google and you get a
Fake
site.
news.
Oh my God, and there's so much hate out there on social media. It's good to actually meet someone who is a Muslim and learn from them rather than from these hate websites. And also not just blindly believe in what the media is presenting and showing all these pictures and videos. I think it's very important. And I think as we're giving the message to others, we have to give message to Muslims also, that we need to reach out. We need to go to the churches. We need to talk about this in our workplaces and things. And because people are thirsty, they want to know what Islam and Muslim. They may not be able to say it. They have questions in their hearts and minds. So we need to be open to field these questions and respond to them.
Great. Well, thank you for being on the show. So we learned a lot today. We learned about what is Sharia law. We learned the fears of Sharia law and also the practical applications, like in marriage disputes, like in between two Muslims and land disputes. And then we learned the American context on the great fear of Sharia law with the presidency and other places and how it's unfounded. And most importantly, the message here is for folks to go visit a mosque, meet a Muslim, and learn more on their own time, and don't believe in fake news. Thank you for being on Open Forum. This is MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland.